Something happened in the Caspian Sea that almost nobody in the Western world is talking about, and by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why that silence is itself one of the most important parts of this story. Let me start with a question. What would happen if a country with a few hundred nuclear warheads decided to bomb an installation directly connected to the interests of a country sitting on top of 6,000 nuclear warheads? Not near that country, not adjacent to it, but directly connected to it, economically, militarily, and strategically. What would the response look like? Would it look like a press release? Would it look like a strongly worded diplomatic note? Or would it look like something far more patient, far more calculated, and ultimately far more dangerous than anything that could fit inside a news headline? Because that is exactly what we are dealing with right now. And the reason most of you have not heard about it is not because the information is hidden. It is because the media institutions that are supposed to be delivering you this information have made a collective editorial decision not to discuss it. I have spent 4 decades writing about power, about geopolitics, about the behavior of nations under pressure, and I want to tell you something clearly before we go any further. What Israel just did in the Caspian Sea is not a footnote. It is not a sidebar. It is potentially one of the most consequential single military decisions made in this entire conflict, and the clock on its consequences has already started. Stay with me, because this is going to take a few minutes to unfold properly, and every single piece of it matters. The port of Anzali sits on the southern coast of the Caspian Sea, inside Iranian territory. If you have never heard of it, that is completely understandable. It does not make the front pages. It does not appear in the maps that television channels use to illustrate this war. But Anzali is, in geopolitical terms, one of the most strategically loaded pieces of real estate in the entire region. It is the primary node connecting Iran to Russia across the Caspian corridor. Russian vessels dock there, cargo moves through there. The economic and military sinews binding Moscow and Tehran together are most visibly joined at exactly that point. Grain moves through Anzali, military equipment moves through Anzali, and according to multiple journalistic sources that have confirmed the essential facts, the drones that Russia has deployed so systematically against Ukrainian infrastructure over the past 2 years have also moved through that corridor. This is not a minor commercial port. This is a lifeline, and it is a lifeline that Russia has invested in, protected, and regarded as a critical artery in its effort to circumvent Western sanctions and maintain its strategic supply chain. And Israel bombed it. The official framing was, as it always is, predictable. A preemptive strike, targeted, necessary, aimed at Iranian naval infrastructure, all of which may even be technically accurate. But here is what that framing deliberately omits. That Iranian naval infrastructure sits inside a port where Russia has significant operational, commercial, and military interests. And more importantly, it sits inside the Caspian Sea, which is not simply a body of water. The Caspian is technically a closed lake, enclosed entirely by 5 states: Russia, Iran, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia has been extraordinarily protective of that zone. The Caspian was a space of tacit cooperation, of carefully maintained equilibrium. No external power interfered there. No one disturbed that balance, until now. What Israel did is the geopolitical equivalent of crossing a threshold that nobody, not even the United States, had dared to approach. Think about that for a moment. Washington, a first-rate military power with enormous reach and far fewer restraints than it publicly acknowledges, kept itself at a careful distance from this corridor. The American sanctions regime, aggressive as it is, had not directly targeted Anzali. The White House understood at some level that touching that particular node meant touching Russia in a way that would require a response. Netanyahu apparently decided that calculation did not apply to him. Now let us be honest about something. Russia supplying arms to Iran is not a surprise. It is not a scandal in the way Western media would present it. The logical structure is identical to the United States supplying bombs to Israel. Bombs that are then used in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Iran. Alliances supply allies. That is what great powers do. The difference, and this is the part that matters enormously, is that Anzali is not simply a weapons transfer point. It is one of the principal ports through which Russian grain moves to crucial markets. It is part of the north-south international transport corridor connecting the Indian Ocean to the Caspian and onward to northern Europe, one of the most important alternative commercial routes in the world. A route that, if disrupted, harms not only Russia and Iran, but also, and this is something almost nobody is discussing, Europe, which depends on the energy transit flowing through that region. Russia's response arrived faster than Israel likely anticipated, and it came in language that left very little room for interpretation. Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson for Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, issued a formal statement. I want to be careful here because Zakharova is not a minor bureaucratic voice. She is exceptionally close to Vladimir Putin. When she speaks in this register, in this tone, with this level of specificity, it carries a weight that goes well beyond a routine press comment. She described Israel's attack as reckless and irresponsible. She issued an explicit warning that actions of this kind will expand the conflict. She stated that Russia will not stand with its arms folded. And then she said something that deserves to be examined very carefully. She stated that this conflict will expand toward the states of the Caspian Sea. Pause on that. The states of the Caspian Sea, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, nations that export massively to global markets and use that sea as their primary commercial artery, nations whose economic stability depends on that corridor remaining intact. Zakharova was not making a vague threat about some distant hypothetical. She was identifying by name the geography of escalation. She was saying, in the formal language of Russian state diplomacy, that Israel has just put all of this at risk. And now I want to explain to you what Russia can actually do without firing a single missile from Russian territory, because this is where the analysis gets genuinely important, and it is where the Western narrative consistently fails its audience by refusing to think past the surface. Russia does not need to enter this war directly. Nobody should expect that. That is not how the Kremlin operates under these conditions. What Russia can do is close Syrian airspace to Israeli aircraft, something it has refrained from doing despite years of Israeli bombardments in Syria. Russia can deliver its most advanced anti-aircraft systems to Hezbollah, systems that would render northern Israel extraordinarily vulnerable in a way that the artisanal rockets of recent years have not managed to do. Russia can supply Iran with missile technology through channels that are difficult to trace and even more difficult to respond to publicly. Russia can accelerate the delivery of military equipment through every alternative route available. None of these actions require a declaration of war. None of them require Russian soldiers on a front line. All of them would be devastating in their consequences. And here is something that adds another layer entirely to this situation. Some time ago, Russia offered Iran a mutual defense treaty modeled on the agreement it had already signed with North Korea, an arrangement establishing that if one party is attacked, the other is obligated to intervene militarily. Iran's parliament rejected it. The faction that still believed in the possibility of a deal with the West, that still held out hope for some negotiated settlement with Washington or Brussels, refused to bind Iran completely to the Russian sphere. They did not want to owe the Kremlin that kind of debt. And so Iran went into this period of escalation without a formal nuclear umbrella, without a legal obligation from Moscow to respond on its behalf. Israel knew this. Israel has been acting on this knowledge. It has been striking Iranian installations precisely because it understands that Russia has no legal obligation to respond, that there is no automatic tripwire. And for a while, that calculation appeared to be working. But by attacking Anzali, Israel moved into entirely different terrain. It stopped attacking Iranian assets and started touching Russian ones. And that changes everything about how Moscow must respond, not legally, but in terms of its own credibility, its own regional standing, its own demonstration that there are, in fact, lines that cannot be crossed without consequence. I am convinced, based on everything I'm observing, that the collateral consequence of this attack will be that Iran returns to Russia and signs the mutual defense treaty that it previously rejected. The very factors that led Tehran to hesitate, the belief that the West might offer something, the reluctance to be fully absorbed into the Russian orbit, have been systematically demolished by the experience of this war. Iran has watched itself be struck repeatedly while Russia observed without any formal obligation to respond. And now Israel has attacked a Russian-connected installation on the Caspian. The Iranian parliament members who argued for keeping distance from Moscow are going to find that argument increasingly difficult to sustain. When that treaty is signed, and I believe it will be, the strategic architecture of this entire conflict changes. The nuclear umbrella that Iran currently lacks would extend over it. The weapon systems that Russia has held back, for reasons that include the absence of a formal alliance, would begin moving through channels that are not symbolic or political, but operational and military. And the S-300 systems that Russia has not yet delivered to Hezbollah would become a realistic near-term possibility rather than a distant hypothetical. Think about what that means for northern Israel. The rocket fire from Lebanon that has already forced hundreds of thousands of Israelis from their homes in the north, the continuous pressure that has demonstrated the deep vulnerability of that border, all of that has been achieved with relatively unsophisticated systems. Advanced Russian anti-aircraft and missile technology in Lebanese hands would represent a qualitatively different situation. It would not be an escalation in degree, it would be an escalation in kind. And I want to return to something I said near the beginning because I think it is the most important frame for understanding all of this. Israel has, in the course of this conflict, systematically generated pressure across every significant front and maritime corridor simultaneously. Gaza has become a quagmire. The Israeli economy is contracting. The Houthis have effectively closed the Red Sea to Israeli interests. Hezbollah has demonstrated that northern Israel is genuinely vulnerable. Iran has penetrated air defenses that were presented to the world as impenetrable. And now Israel has opened a dimension in the Caspian, the one space where Russian interests are directly engaged, the one space where crossing a line does not produce a press release but produces a patient, calculated, and ultimately far more consequential response. A country with several hundred nuclear warheads has just provoked a country with 6,000. Not accidentally, not through miscommunication. Deliberately, with full knowledge of what Anzali represents and who has interests there. That is the calculation being made in Jerusalem, and I believe it is profoundly mistaken, not because Russia will launch missiles at Tel Aviv, that is not how this works, but because Russia does not forget, because Russia does not do mowing the grass and moving on, because the Kremlin operates on a timescale and with a patience that is entirely foreign to the logic driving Israeli decision-making right now. What Zakharova said was not rhetoric, it was a formal declaration, delivered in the name of the Russian state, that the consequences of this attack are already in motion. The question is not whether Russia will respond, the question is what form that response will take, on what timeline, and through which channels. And the answer to that question will shape this conflict in ways that the Western media, so focused on the immediate tactical picture, is almost entirely unprepared to explain to you. This is the conversation we need to be having. Not instead of the other conversations, but in addition to them. Because the world does not run on the narratives that are comfortable for the major networks to broadcast. It runs on interests, on credibility, on the patient exercise of power by states that understand that some moves take months or years to fully materialize. Russia understands that. And right now, Israel is finding out what it means to have crossed a line with a power that never forgets, never forgives, and never, ever operates on anyone else's timeline but its own.